Hello, everyone, and welcome to WooStream's Willamette in Dialogue webinar series, where we're bringing Willamette to you specifically through a Woo lens with our latest session, Listening to Grief. My name is Tiffany Newton, and I'm the Director of Alumni and Community here at the university. Tonight's session will focus on grief, loss, and relationships. I'm excited to introduce you to our speaker, Professor Maegan Brooks. Maegan Parker Brooks is an associate professor and chair of Civic Communication and Media Department, the Civic Communication Media Department here at Willamette University. At Willamette, she teaches courses in death and grief communication and facilitates the diversity of loss grief support group. Beyond Willamette, Maegan co-facilitates a group for adult caregivers of grieving teens at Dougie Center, and she recently earned a certificate in art-assisted grief therapy at the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition. Professor Brooks, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Yeah, thank you, Tiffany. Thank you for making space for this important conversation. And I do want to say thank you to the viewers, whether you're joining us live tonight or you're watching this later. I appreciate you also being here to learn more about how to support your own grief journey and the journeys of others. It really is a community effort to provide grief support. So thank you all for being here.
So to start off, of course, we all have our own experiences with this topic, and I'm wondering if you would really kind of take the stage and share a bit, if you're comfortable, with your own experiences with grief and how you came to kind of be here at this moment.
Yeah, thank you. I'm an autoethnographer in terms of my research methodology, so I appreciate this question. I think it's really important that we always situate ourselves within our research, right? So I believe that researchers always are interested in what they're doing, whether or not they're sharing that biographical aspect as well. So I would say, you don't make it to middle age without enduring significant losses. And in my case, it's no different. I had friends in high school, a friend in high school who died by suicide, and one in college. And then I had a period in my life where I lost a lot of people that were very close to me, grandparents, aunts and uncles. But it was really the death of my dad, the sudden death of my dad by a heart attack. And then the death of my younger sister, Emily, by opioid overdose that got me into researching grief and death communication. And I will just, I'll share my screen here. I have some visuals to go along here. So this is my sister Emily's Zoom memorial. So she died in fall of 2020. So it was during the COVID pandemic, and we weren't able to meet in person to celebrate her life. So this was the background for the Zoom memorial that I organized. And I found her death to be particularly difficult for, lots of reasons. It was an out of order death. She was my younger sister. She died at the age of 37. She died of an opioid overdose we're talking about this a lot in our culture. So it was really difficult for me to be surrounded by that discourse and also personally affected. And we were also isolated, right? And so we know that peer support and community support is so important in grief. And I really didn't have much of that, right? We couldn't even gather with our family, our extended family together to honor her life. And so what I did intuitively, I now know the evidence-based practices behind it, but intuitively, I took to art making. And so in the center of the Zoom background here, you can see this was her self-portrait that I had blown up on canvas to put behind. And then I started creating a back-facing portrait of her. And again, I've done more into the research now. I can share about that later if people are interested about, I think, why I chose to focus on her back instead of, creating a portrait of her. But I really turned to art making, and I found it incredibly calming for my nervous system and regulating. And I found it to be an important way to connect both with my sister and my father, both of whom were formally trained artists. I am not. I've come to this in my grief and not as a formally trained artist. But yeah, so I'll just say in terms of my grief journey, really sparked by the loss of my sister.
And it's one of those things where it gave it for so many people, it gives you something to do, to process, to sit with, to hold space, and can be really transformative to folks. Are there other things that you tapped into as part of this, as you kind of went from someone experiencing a profound loss, several losses, to kind of going back into your wheelhouse as a professional researcher, as an academic, and what that pathway of information finding and knowing and really digging into this topic with both sides, both your personal self and then your professional and academic self.
Yeah, absolutely. My grief journey then continued right from this experience to piquing my curiosity and also wanting to help support other bereaved people, including our students, right? So this was during the COVID pandemic, and I was hearing so many stories of grief that our students were experiencing. And so I wanted to understand not just that the arts could be helpful or that writing or communication could be helpful, but I wanted to know theoretically why, and then how could I be someone who could lead other people through this. And so I engaged in a variety of training to learn more. And the first formal training I did was with the Hedgebrook Women Authoring Change group. It's a residency, but I did it online again during the pandemic. So I took classes on grief and healing. I think it was called Grief Plus Healing, but they were a series of writing workshops that I did. And again, was just really amazed. I hadn't found many things other than the art making that had been helpful to me, but the writing really was. And it was a very different kind of writing than the academic writing that I had done. And so I got to thinking, what if there were community groups where we could come together and engage in writing and dialogue or art making. And so I saw that the Oregon Humanities was offering facilitator training. And I had this idea about creating these community grief circles. So I went to Oregon Humanities. I attended, it was finally in person training, their facilitator training. And as fate would have it, it was led by a woman, Jennifer Alcazani, who had been volunteering at the Dougie Center for nearly 20 years at that point. And she kind of snagged me at lunch and she said, I like your idea, but you should know that there is this national center that's internationally renowned right here in Portland, and they're doing conversations about grief. They're offering grief support to families starting at age 3 all the way up through adults. They incorporate the arts. So maybe you should just look into the Dougie Center. And so I did that evening, in fact, and that evening I filled out a volunteer application and was like, this is what I want to do. And so I went through the formal volunteer facilitator program there, and then began facilitating a group for adult caregivers of grieving teens. And so the adult caregivers may have lost their spouse or a child, and they're bringing a teen to the group. And then we meet as a group of adults while the teens are interacting with each other too. And that was so powerful that I then thought, okay, I want to be formally trained in this. And then I began to pursue my art-assisted grief therapy certification through the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition. So yeah, what started as a real personal way of coping with loss and communicating that loss has grown and will continue to grow. I just got back from the European Grief Conference in Dublin last month, and it was incredible. There were over 34 countries represented there, practitioners, policymakers, scholars talking about innovative approaches to grief. So it'll be an ongoing learning for me.
And it's definitely one of those topics. I mean, what a journey, and kind of taking your meaningful roles and training and finding a process that meets you both where you're at personally and then plays to your professional skill sets. I was struck by you saying that the center's been around for 30 years when so many of us don't even necessarily have conversations about this topic regularly. And I wanted to ask, I know you work not only here at the university in this space, in the classroom and with our campus, broader campus community, but also with community members in Portland in our area. Can you share about how you got involved in those spaces. You talked about it a little, but kind of dive into that next step of what that work has been like and where it is now.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, there are a lot of fateful moments, I feel like, in the last 4 years that have come together to meet a clear need. So just as I was going through my Dougie Center training, Chaplain Pearl Player was talking at the university about creating a grief group or reinstating. There have been grief groups throughout Willamette's history, but bringing one back. And so I thought, absolutely, I want to help with this. How can I help support this? And so Pearl and I worked together to create what we now call the Diversity of Loss. And it's gone through several different transformations. And now it's housed in the Civic Communication and Media Department. I run it out of the Ringing Media Lab. We are a closed group, and that just means we're open to all the Willamette community. But once you register, we have an 8-week session, and it's the same group of people. It's a really incredible intergenerational group. We have students, faculty, staff. We're open to members of the Institute for Continued Learning. So really a cross-generational group there. And each semester I train a student in grief facilitation. So they're co-facilitating the group with me, and we take an arts-based approach. And so this is our poster from the fall here. I also wanted to incorporate this into the communication curriculum formally. So I created a grief communication class, and it was important to me to set this class at the 200 level without any prerequisites, because I wanted to bring in students who are maybe interested in becoming veterinarians, nurses, doctors, teachers, pastoral support, counselors. I wanted to cast a broad net and have, really any students interested in the caregiving professions sign up for this class was my hope. And I was a little worried. As Tiffany, as you've been saying, we don't really like to talk about grief a lot in our culture. And so the first time I offered this class, I was thinking, I just hope that some students register and we can offer it periodically. And I was delightfully surprised that it has grown to be a real, I will say immodestly that it's a very popular class on campus. And now we had 40 people on the wait list for this fall for a 20-person class, and similar wait lists into the spring. And so I've been able to now offer this class every semester. And in fact, I've added now the death communication class, because I realized in the grief class, we were so focused on bereavement care and providing compassionate support. And I did have students saying, what about talking with people as they near the end of their life? Like, what about that form of communication? Or what about talking about death phobia? We had death doulas coming into our grief communication class, and I thought, they're absolutely right. So I created a college colloquium, actually, that focused on death communication. I called it Talking About Death Won't Kill You. And we're here. This is an example of our group. We were working on making luminaries for the Children's Healing Art Project fundraiser that was held in Portland. So they're working on that art project, and they had a death doula come in and also volunteer with CHAP and walk us through this process. And so that's our classroom there. We also hosted the first 2 death cafes on Willamette's campus that were really great events for all the students who organized them and the students who attended. So so it's really blossoming, here on campus in terms of these different ways that I get to engage with our community about death and grief.
And I just have to say, the feedback and what we've heard also from other community members is really incredible. And just a quick point of clarification, if I may, the reason that there's the class and then the closed 8-week session group that is focused on internal Willamette community members and not necessarily broader community members and alumni, as it were. There was a question about it. I'm assuming that it's for some privacy and some other considerations.
Yeah, absolutely. So privacy, and also honestly, we don't open it up to the broader beyond campus community too, because of space. We are at capacity. This is the room actually where we meet for the Diversity of Loss group. And best practices really are not to have these groups larger than about 10 to 12 people max. And so with the shuttering of the Spiritual and Religious Life office, now that we're running it just out of the Civic Communication and Media program, this is what we can do now. But I am certainly open to hearing if there is alumni interest to think about maybe other things we can do to meet that need. Right now, this is what we're able to provide. Yeah.
And progress, not perfection. Do what you can and
I do
add
it
more to
well.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, do it well. And so I just wanted to mention that. And for those with us, please know that there are a lot of resources and other information that will be shared as we go along. Just kind of bringing it back to all the different places and spaces that you're engaging in this work. Are there major differences or similarities between the guidance that you might provide and what this process looks like between the Dougie Center, our peer supported diversity of loss group, and the class? Like those, they're very different spaces, I'm assuming, in some way.
Yeah, yeah. I love this question because I think about this a lot, but nobody has ever asked me that to sort of verbalize it. So I think it's just such an interesting question. Absolutely. So I can say, the Dougie Center and the group I support is actually in Canby. So we have 3 locations: Beaverton, Canby, and Portland. And so in our group in Canby, we're all parents of grieving teens in that group. And so we have that in common, right? Right off the bat. And we are all grieving death-related losses. That is a focus of the Dougie Center. The diversity of loss group is quite different in that respect. And so we're open in the diversity of loss group to both death and non-death losses. In fact, I'm planning to get another certification in non-death losses. So things like ecological grief is a big one that folks are mourning right now. Things like losses in terms of ability. And so, yeah, so beyond that, and that differentiates us. And then the time, right? Because the diversity of loss group, I'm trying to make it as accessible as possible for members of our community. I do this in 1 hour versus Dougie Center. It's in the evenings. We have an hour and a half. And so it's different that way. And then I guess I would add to the communication classes, I do have to be clear about, I want students to bring their whole selves into the class, and I want them to, reflect deeply on losses in their own life, to be more self-aware and supportive of others. But the classroom can't be and shouldn't be really a therapeutic space, right? And so I do have to really differentiate between the work that we can provide at diversity of loss and then what we do in the classroom. And so that's taken me a bit of time. I think as a student myself in the art-assisted grief therapy program, I learned better how to have that conversation in a sensitive way. So of course, you're welcome to reflect on your own losses. I mean, in grief communication, we're writing eulogies, we're writing obituaries, and they should be about people that you care about, but also knowing that it's okay to not touch that deeply if you don't feel fully safe in a classroom environment to do that, right? Because there's maybe 25 students and one of me, and it's not, the same space. So yeah, there are a lot, even though we're all, talking about similar things in terms of death, dying, and grief, there are a lot of differences between, yeah.
But that's also such an interesting experiential learning opportunity when it comes to like, how do you handle rapport and managing your own affect in a space that's talking about difficult conversations and topics? What do you bring forward, or what do you maybe regulate a little bit more within yourself, depending upon the focus of a certain conversation, a certain space? And that's something I'm sure that, we'll talk about when we get to grief around the holidays, and how you engage with people with whether it's your grief experience or theirs, and that relational ability. So much of it is about what is the right thing to do or the appropriate thing to do given what you know up to this point, and then how that's playing out in a specific setting or in a specific relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add to that and sort of sing our students' praises here a little bit too. So our students are not only grow in their ability to do that, but then to take these difficult topics and engage the community with them too. And so I've got a few pictures here of, this is a group of students that presented with me last spring for the Institute for Continued Learning here on campus. Another group put together. And so these are, sorry, I'll just pause on this one for a minute. These are students from grief communication who are doing wonderful things in the community for grief. So this is more Morgan Murray here. They're also now a formerly trained Dougie Center volunteer working with younger kids. Linnea Lovetang, also formerly trained Dougie Center volunteer working at the Canby location with children too. Lily and I co-presented research that we did for an independent study at a national conference, and we're publishing our findings. We'll share that in the references link about how to provide grief support just peer-to-peer. And then Lillian Hubble is co-facilitating with me in the spring, the diversity of loss group. So not only are students learning how to kind of like thread that needle in the classroom, then they're taking that knowledge out. Linnea also created or co-created a peer support grief group at a high school for part of their psychology senior work. And then several students from grief communication here organized a journaling for well-being convocation series, and so we presented that too. And then this is a book I'll share a link to for the viewers of oh gosh, we have 13 different approaches, art-based approaches to grief expression that are all designed by students, and they practice these arts-based expression approaches on each other and on themselves, and then wrote and reflected about it here too. So doing some really great work in that sort of Willamette way of transforming knowledge into action.
Well, and it's so incredible because it also ripples out. They have those conversations in other spaces that they're in, with other groups that they're with. It sounds like a couple of them might become professionals kind of in this space and follow a pathway into being maybe a grief therapist or an art therapist, or have found a meaningful role through their exposure to this topic and being able to dig in. That's so exciting. Are there any other examples that are really salient at the moment that you've seen or that?
Yeah, I mean, I've just been overwhelmingly impressed with the way students have applied this knowledge. At least 3 former grief communication students have worked with adults in custody at the Oregon State Penitentiary one on journaling, one on disenfranchised grief. So thinking about the grief that's not necessarily death related, right? But the loss of being in custody and being separated from your family. So working there, another student designed a program for Native youth in Hawaii on grief and intergenerational trauma. That student just applied to medical schools. So yeah, I mean, it's the creativity that students take and apply these, ideas we're learning in all sorts of ways that are meaningful to them, but really meaningful to the community. It's really, really astounding.
Oh, and I know we're just going to have more and more stories, and it's just going to keep growing, but in a way that really brings a lot of care and attention into our on-campus communities, and then provides a lot more expertise and learning outside of that. And with that, I kind of want to transition a little bit, if I may, to your expertise and really the time of the year it is. And, as we all enter the holiday season, the winter season, it's really a time to reflect on where we are in our lives, what we're experiencing. Maybe there are people that are no longer with us, for really transformative holiday experiences and things that change throughout our lives. So it goes without saying that grief can come up at any point during the day or the year. And that, again, the holidays are an instance where a loss of relationship can be magnified, or, you just don't see that familiar face. Could you share some advice around what people can do in different situations that might be anticipating a difficult holiday season for themselves or for people that they're connected with at various levels or different spaces that they might be in?
Yeah. Yeah. And I like how you put that too, Tiffany, that losses affect us all year round, right? But there really is something about this particular season. I think it's a variety of some things, right? I think it's the long nights of darkness, right, that are difficult. I think it's this felt pressure to be celebrating and to be happy and joyful when you might not authentically feel like that. And then, as you were saying, when extended family gets together and there's a person so obviously missing, it can be really difficult. So I'm always reluctant to give grievers advice because my whole theory is that everybody sort of knows within them what they need. It's more about how do we companion them. But I do have some suggestions that I think could be helpful any time of year for grief, but especially right now. So I've got more resources on this, but I think I've tried to distill all that's out there in terms of the research into some clear takeaways. So I'll share some of my ideas there. The first one is rather obvious, but I think we all can use these reminders, especially around this time of year, and that is to care for yourself. If you are actively grieving right now, you are likely exhausted. You're likely feeling very emotionally spent by the end of the day. You might be experiencing social anxiety. It's difficult to make small talk or have the bandwidth to engage socially. And so things you can do to sort of help with that, they're not going to take the grief away or, make you feel 100%, but caring for yourself physically. So even small things like, brief walks outside in nature, getting fresh air can be soothing to your nervous system and emotionally. Caring for yourself emotionally. So setting boundaries around things that are going to be too emotionally taxing for you this year, and just being clear about that. I can't attend this particular event, or I might attend and it might be too much for me and I'm going to be okay leaving, right? And so being really careful with yourself that way. And socially too, if there are people and situations that are going to be draining for you or insensitive to you, you don't need to put yourself in that situation this year if your grief is feeling particularly resonant for you. So I do also want to say that grief and joy can coexist, right? So, sometimes I'll be talking with grievers and they'll be saying, I felt guilty laughing. I felt bad, like I'd somehow betrayed my person, that I was really enjoying myself. And so I would just say there's a well-known theory in the field of thanatology, which is the death, dying, and bereavement studies, called the dual process model of grief. And the idea is that we oscillate as grievers between a loss orientation and a restoration orientation. And as we go through our daily lives, we're constantly moving back and forth between a loss orientation, deeply feeling the loss of our person and trying to adjust to our life without them, and a restoration focus where we're trying to, we have to find a new way to live our lives, right? And so there's both remembering that person and then also reintegrating into the world. And those can coexist within the same event, right? You can miss your person deeply and also find joy and comfort in the people that are around you. So I would say care for yourself, number one. The second sort of C here would be to companion others. If you're supporting someone who's grieving, and odds are if you're grieving, then there are a lot of other grieving people in your close circle, right? As you grieve the same person, but in a different way. I would say listen to their grief experiences. Even if you're grieving the same person, you're not going to be grieving them the same way, right? You've got a different relationship with them. You have different resources that you're drawing upon. So listen to their grief experience and try to take turns. So you really are hearing what they have to say and not shifting the conversation to your own grief. And so you can understand how are they grappling with this grief. That will best enable you to provide compassionate, responsive care to them, right? So if you're listening to support and understand them, you will be able to hear better what types of support would actually be helpful to them, right? And respect differences in the grief process. So my mom died over Labor Day, so a pretty recent death. This is the first holiday season without her. And my older sister has decided she is not celebrating. She's not celebrating Christmas this year. I have young kids and that's not an option, but I'm respecting that we have a different approach to what the holidays are going to look like this year. And then when I say companioning, I really differentiate that from fixing or saving. So companioning is a model of grief care that is, walking alongside, but recognizing that the bereaved have within themselves what they need to heal themselves and reintegrate into the world. It's more about providing a supportive ear, helping where you can, but not thinking about their grief as a problem to be fixed or that you need to swoop in and cheer them up, right? So kind of having that approach of companioning. And the last one, and again, this is true sort of all times of the year, I would say continue your bond with the person that you lost. We used to think about, the sort of misunderstood 5 stages of death, which became the 5 stages of grief, like ending with this idea of acceptance really dominated our thinking about grief for a long time in the Western world. And also the idea of closure, I hear a lot, like, I just need to find closure. What we're finding in the research right now is it's much more about continuing your bonds with your person as a healthy way to grieve. So finding ways that you can connect to them. That for me has been through art making. For you, it might be through listening to music, right? Or it might be through holiday traditions, like hanging an ornament on the tree that reminds you of them, or setting up a space at the table for them, right? But finding ways to continue bonds. I work with people who write letters to their deceased loved one, or who kind of journal back and forth, imagining what the person might say. That is all very healthy, right? However, you can find a way to like reshape your relationship with your person. You don't have to come to sort of closure, or I'm going to be shut off from this. That is a really that can be a real damaging approach to grieving. For some people, it might be necessary depending on the nature of the relationship, but in most cases, we think about how can you continue that bond.
Well, and it's such an integrative way to view it. Like you still maintain those memories, those pieces of yourselves, the traditions, and it's just an interesting way to understand that you need to get through this process. So you need to care for yourself and continue doing the things that you know and love and that bring you joy, or that you just have to do to survive the day, to be there for others, knowing that it is presence, not perfection. You will, as you said in your article, you will never say the perfect thing. There are no perfect words or actions, which I found so meaningful because I am one of those that's like, just tell me exactly what to say. And that is completely not the point. It's the process, the listening, the leaning in, the presence. And then, like you said, you do not have to close off pieces of yourself or your memories or things that are important to you, meaningful roles, if that is not appropriate or comfortable with your process and where you need to be okay. So yeah. Is there anything else within this that you have found salient, or things that you have leaned into as far as a book or something else that has maybe academically or more on the it's kind of funny meme side? There's a range of different things that we all lean into when we're looking for support and information.
Yeah, absolutely. So I put together some resources, different things that I've mentioned throughout this part of the webinar. There are several on here for about grieving in the holidays, and they're from really trusted sources that I would turn to. So this piece here by Bob Neimeyer. He's the director of the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition. It's a great piece about grieving in the holidays. There's one from the Dougie Center as well. So there's a lot of information out there, and you kind of find what is helpful to you, but there are a couple in there. I have a link to the student authored collection of expressive arts activities. And so these are really short, accessible, 4 to 5 page articles. So they're not really long scholarly articles, but they give folks a range of ideas. So if anything in there resonates with you from there was one student who was really into movement and dance. And so there's a piece that is based on, research and evidence from the field and then applied in her own creative, innovative approach. And there's ones with poetry, collage, so a range of modalities that people can use. And I'm sharing these with full permission. The students are excited to have their work out there in the world. And then, just in terms of a couple of the concepts we've talked about, like the idea of continuing the bonds and how that's different from the 5 stages of grief model that I think so many of us are familiar with. So there's a brief accessible article about that. And then, tenets of companioning the bereaved. So again, that difference between sort of like fixing grief and being a companion, I think that's well explained there. So folks can, if they are interested in it, can kind of dig a little bit deeper into any of these topics.
And I appreciate you for coming with all of this information and so many resources, especially because it can be overwhelming when you research this. If you go to Amazon first or Google, there's just so many different things. And for those who are watching, have joined us this evening or are watching this later, these links and things will be mailed out and also posted with this content so that they can easily access that. I know we have a couple of questions that people have submitted before in the pre-registration and then have also come through in the chat. So we'll dig into that. But before I do, just to transition, is there anything else that you have that you want to touch on before we kind of popcorn it with a bunch of different facets of grief? Because it's just such a huge topic.
Yeah, no, it is a huge topic. No, I'm very open to questions that other folks have. I feel like, it's ironic. I'm talking about listening to grief and talking the whole time. So happy to hear what people are interested in and we'll respond accordingly.
Yeah, one of the first ones that was pre-submitted is really interesting because it goes into social isolation, which is a trained social worker is one of the biggest kind of things that we're finding is determinative to people's overall health and longevity and different things. And so what they're asking is, what advice do you have, or what does the research support around reducing the sense of isolation, aloneness that grief can create?
Yeah, this is such an important question. And exactly for the reasons you're naming, Tiffany, right? Like this is important for all human beings, right? But especially vital in grief. And we are in the midst of a loneliness epidemic in our culture. And so grief tends to compound that. You feel, I still, my sister's been, dead for almost 4 years now. And I still have a hard time with things like sibling day on social media. I still feel resentful. Yeah, it's hard, right? And yeah, so I do have a couple ideas about how to overcome or minimize social isolation, because it was a big thing for me in grieving, especially grieving during the pandemic. And I've helped a few folks through a similar thing. So I would say, there are support groups available for the bereaved, and the Dougie Center has on their website, dougie.org, they have a group finder, and you can type in your zip code and where you are, and they can recommend groups around you. So that's one way. That's not everybody's comfort level, right? And so other ways that the bereaved have shared with me, that they find social support are, online through social media and groups that way. And at first I thought, oh, I wonder if those are, very effective. And so I looked into, the research. I conducted my own survey about them, and I am finding, just more and more increasingly that they fill a huge need. And part of what I found in my survey results when I surveyed people on social media about their talking about grief, is they said they weren't comfortable talking about grief in social situations with people because they didn't know how people would respond. And so putting grief out there on even their Facebook or their Instagram account, and then having the time to read comments and respond when they were comfortable and felt like they could, was huge for them. I also know of caregivers in my group that have gone to specific Facebook groups like for widows or for widowers. So those have some definite value, absolutely. And then maybe a sort of non-traditional one that I would recommend, that has worked well for me, and I just watched a presentation about this at the European Grief Conference, would be bibliotherapy and cinema therapy. So by that I mean finding a book that could be, creative, it could be fiction, where someone has experienced a loss, not identical to yours maybe, but like yours. In fact, I just read a book written by a woman my age. It was a fiction book, but it was about a woman who lost her sister and then is a young mom and, sort of raising her kids without her sister there. And that can be incredibly therapeutic. And the research bears this out too, to sort of read through someone else's experience and feel like they're saying things or they're putting things in a way that you've felt, but you've never been able to articulate. It can be really powerful. And similarly, if reading isn't your thing, watching movies that have related storylines, sometimes those can be very activating. So I would say sort of proceed with caution. But I felt like I was at a point in my grief journey recently where I could read a book like that. I think probably, even 3 years ago, I would not have been able to do that. So yeah, those are just some different ideas about how to overcome social isolation, because that is a huge problem to be concerned with in grief.
And And it ties into so much about feeling like you're understood or you're seen or that there's a relevance to your own experience or being able to maybe understand and empathize with someone else because the grief journey is different, but you can, see how you might react or learn more about that experience. I know, of course, we have folks online with us and who will be watching this from all kinds of generations and ages and life stages, and caretaker responsibilities or different family systems, different social system structures. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, do you have any advice on handling the grief process in elder to elder relationships where they've maybe entered that phase of life where they're starting to lose more of their peers or more people just because that's kind of how age progresses and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And that can be particularly challenging because of that compounded loss, right? And so, losing a close friend or family member is heart-wrenching, but losing someone on the heels of someone you've just lost and you feel almost like these waves are just coming over you before you have a chance to catch your breath. I mean, that can be really debilitating. And so, no, I appreciate that question. One thing I'm finding in the Salem community, a shout out for David McMillan, leads Death Cafe. And they were meeting at Tomorrow We Die, but I think they're meeting at Ike Box now, but they also meet online. And it does attract a large elderly population. And I think that, Death Cafes are not grief groups. They're a place to sort of explore topics related to death and dying. But certainly, I think people who have lost, quite a few people in their circle are drawn to having those conversations when often in other settings, right, we bring these topics up and people like don't want to talk about it at all, want to change the topic, right? So looking at a death cafe, even if a grief group wouldn't be right for you, could be one. And then I think, taking time both, in elder to elder relationships for your own distinct grief experiences, right? You can be there to support one another, and that's really powerful. But also, are you taking time for yourself and your own grief experience, which might be different, right, than your partner or your best friend? So, pausing, acknowledging how significant these losses are and how they're shaping your experience, trying to seek out some forms of social support, and ultimately really taking time to tend to your own grief. As you know, the losses are not going to stop completely, right? Like this is the nature of life. We're going to keep losing people that are close to us, and it can be really overwhelming.
Yeah. And just acknowledging that it can suck. It's not going to be great. It's going to be messy. It's going to, there's all kinds of different things. And whether you're laughing through tears or just laughing or just crying or you can't emote at all, there are so many normal responses to grief and wherever you are at. And I also want to dive into the question a little bit because we have someone that had asked, how do younger folks, maybe, someone my age who's supporting parents who might be losing a spouse or managing different things, like how might that be slightly different versus maybe it's a younger person supporting an elderly person through a process, or it's an elderly person or someone that's the caretaker, like at Dougie, supporting a teen that's going through a really different thing, because we all have different things that we bring to it depending upon our experiences and our life stage and even our own normal development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so certainly the question about, how do elder to elder relationships cope is a very salient one. I also think something that we don't talk about enough is childhood bereavement. I mean, we know that 1 in 12 children will lose a caretaker, so parent, or a sibling by the age of 18. So when students are coming to Willamette, fully 8% of our students, just statistically speaking, have had a major significant loss in their life. And so I think recognizing that we all, so, young people, middle-aged people, elderly people, we're all experiencing loss, right? Throughout our lives. And we all have different resources that we can bring to discussions about loss. So how can we create these mutually supportive environments with each other? And I think the biggest one is like taking the time and making the effort to talk about it, right? A lot of times students in my grief communication class, when they choose to write a eulogy for their grandparent who passed, they're talking with their mom or dad about their parent, right? And that might be one of the first times they've had real deep, meaningful conversations, because maybe the grandparent died when the parents felt they were too young to talk too much about that, but they're learning about their person, right? And so I think, course assignments are one thing, but we need to find more opportunities to connect with each other about it. And I often think, in response to the specific first part of your question, Tiffany, about like how can maybe people our age, support elderly people in their grief. I think it's really slowing down, pausing, and taking the time to say, gosh, it seems like, you just lost dad, and now, you're losing your friend. Like this must have taken its toll. Like what can I do that might be supportive? Maybe we could check in with each other once a week and just be someone to listen to, right? Someone to listen to the grieving person could be helpful too. So yeah, that intergenerational support is really important. Yeah, grief is everybody's work, right?
I know. Well, unfortunately, yes, and so true. And then the emerging adulthood piece is really important, and the fact that Willamette, we're working with, of course, there are older students and all kinds of folks that come to campus and work on campus, but we're often, helping folks become the adults that they're going to be on that pathway, and it's such an interesting part in addition to their education. I know another question we have, kind of switching gears, that came in through the chat. What does your research suggest about survivor's guilt and how people can, address that when they feel like it might be their fault, the loss of a child, or just being the one that's left?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Guilt is a very valid emotion in grief. It doesn't even have to be at all rational, right? And a lot of times the way people respond, when they're supporting someone who has lost someone and is expressing that guilt is, oh, you shouldn't feel that way. They wouldn't want you to feel that way. You did nothing wrong, or you did everything you could, right? All of these. And I certainly got that from people when I would talk about, maybe there was more I could have done to support my sister in her addiction, right? Support her in her recovery efforts from addiction. And I think the more helpful approach would be just listening to people share what they feel, whether or not it's rational, whether or not it makes sense. And if you're the person that's feeling that sense of guilt, finding a way to express it, right? And if it's guilt, it might be tethered to emotions of shame, and you might not want to be sharing that in a support group, for example. It might be very liberating to share it, I will say, because when it comes up in our groups, people are like nodding, yes, I've also felt like this, right? So that can be validating. But you could share it in terms of writing a letter to the deceased person about what it is that you're feeling guilty about, right? And opening up the conversation that way. You could express it in different forms of art and reflection, just getting it out so you can reflect it back to you instead of having this guilt and shame cycle sort of ruminating, I think could be really healthy. But knowing that even the feelings themselves are very valid, again, even if they don't have any basis in, rational thought, and you really did everything that you could do, and you're not going to be able to change the outcome. But I do think that is a very natural, but it can be a very debilitating part of the process.
And it's definitely one where there's a lot of psychotherapy and other supports. So if people are thinking, please, again, take care of yourself. But that is something that can also be addressed in a therapeutic process as well. Another question, because it's so much about grief, the few times we do engage with it in our lives, or where it comes up and is most salient, is often around our rituals and the symbolism and the practices we have around grief. And someone has asked a very pertinent question around, with Zoom, with the pandemic, some of our grief traditions have changed. We may not be having big funerals or celebrations of life. There might not be that ceremonial or that big specific place to gather and to grieve and to process. Have you talked with anyone or discussed, people who they want to support an individual's preference, but that was part of how they learned to process grief, and not having those same ceremonies or those same moments of reflection and community can be difficult to adjust with. Have you engaged with that at all?
Yeah, I mean, there's a death doula by the name of Valenka Donovan Valenzuela, and I can share her. I'm trying to remember the name of her website, but she is also an end of life celebrant. And one of the services that she offers is sort of a ritual do over, right? And so if you were unsatisfied with the ritual surrounding your person's last rites, she will work with you to create what feels meaningful to you. And I'm not saying everybody needs to go work with Valenka, though she is wonderful, and I would highly recommend that. But I think we can take the spirit of that into our daily lives, right? So if the ritual that was organized for your person left you feeling unsatisfied, if it was the obituary, the eulogy, the actual ceremony itself, it's never too late to have another one, right? Like we are going to do something for my sister 4 years later this spring, right? In connection with my mom's service, and so there's really no time limit to that. Grief lasts, as long as you're separated from the person. So I would just encourage folks to maybe think creatively and capaciously and think about how important those rituals are, and maybe organize something that feels right to you.
I love the idea of a do-over, taking whatever steps you can control within your means and as appropriate to do that. Speaking of which, folks have come in with all kinds of questions, but I wanted to discuss that, often we talk about grief in relation to a person or relationship, a loss in that interpersonal way, but they're asking, are there other types that are just as legitimate, whether that's with the pet, like you said, whether it's climate, if just very briefly, because I know we're getting close to time, if there are other types or examples of grief that you've encountered that we can add legitimacy to. Those feelings happen, those situations happen. They're valid.
Absolutely. So I would say ecological grief is probably the one that's on so many of our minds now, as our surroundings are changing, and there's a really vast literature now on ecological grief. So that would be one. I would say, forms of disenfranchised grief. So grief that doesn't get recognized as such by society, but is nevertheless deeply felt. And this could be job loss, right? So losing a sense of your identity in losing your job. It could be divorce. It could be, I do work with students who are grieving a sense of self as they transition during this time of college. So, I would say death and non-death losses, we don't, in the diversity of loss sort of rank order, which is, worse or more important. We accept that there are really a range of losses, and the knowledge that we have from research in the field of thanatology can be really useful in navigating even non-death losses too, which are very valid.
Appreciate that. Another question that came in is really around, your article, of course, is listening to grief. It's about that companion process. We talked about self-care. Can you discuss a little bit, like how do you listen to yourself? Just a little reminder of how you've sat with or tuned in, if you're willing to share with that.
Sure. I mean, I think the first part of it for me is slowing down. Doing this work, and I want to do it well, and I want to show up for people. And so realizing what boundaries I have to put in place, that I can't be everywhere all the time, doing that. So setting up a life for myself that is sustainable enough to do this work means slowing down. And that's when I hear my own I can really feel and sense my own grief processes. That's when I can be in touch with those, so that I can show up and be really supportive to others. It's also when I feel most connected to my dad and my sister, is when I slow down and give myself, even if it's 15 minutes of art making in the evenings or something like that. But having those habitual practices. And then I'm in my office now, and I do have a sign. There's a list of all my self-care practices. Not that I practice them every day, but I have rest, walk, paint, garden, cook food, right? These are things that I try and continually remind myself, so that I'm not just preaching these things to other people, but that I'm practicing them as well.
And we're almost done, but there's two other questions that have come in before the last thing into recommendations. For some people, it is so overwhelming that even touching their toe into grief, into sitting, into slowing down can just feel impossible. In those situations where it might be paralysis almost, is that the time to seek professional care, or is there other recommendation? And I'm sorry if I led that was leading of me, but when it becomes almost insurmountable or that difficult.
Yeah, I mean, we do know that roughly 10% of the population it could experience what's been called prolonged grief disorder. I don't like the terminology of disordered grief, but I do know that it is true that there are people who suffer really debilitating grief. The DSM-5 characterizes it as lasting over a year, getting in the way of doing your day-to-day tasks and caring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to, that is a thing in this culture. And then yes, absolutely, professional help would be great there. And these other resources, right? Because professional help, maybe you're looking at an hour a week. And so like, how do you start there maybe, and also set up things like self-care rituals, and maybe even look at support circles in addition. I've certainly worked with people who were seeing a therapist, coming to grief group, and then developing their own journal practice, for example. So a variety, sort of a broad base of wraparound care support. Yeah.
So, and from my professional practice and other things, it's really, there's no one right answer, but it's having as many options as possible, or continuing to seek out if something doesn't work for you, even if it worked for someone else. There's so many different resources and tools and information, and even just saying I'm struggling can be an indicator to have other people companion you as well in this. So please, for those who have joined this or watched later, please know if you can speak up in any way to people that you think will be supportive, or to professionals, that can be really important. And right before we kind of close up, because we're just about at time, one of the final questions is really around, you're doing this as a professor, you're doing this as an educated practitioner in the space, you're doing this as a mentor to students and community members and others. How do you navigate like having boundaries and that line, and knowing what you bring forward, what maybe you hold back a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, that's a doozy to end with.
I know.
I will say now that I have, finished classes for the semester. So I mentioned just briefly that my mom died over Labor Day weekend, and it was a sudden death. And I didn't tell my students this semester because I couldn't talk about it in a classroom. And I didn't know them, right? So we'd met for 2 class periods, right? And then I had this, really profound experience over Labor Day weekend. And then we came back on Tuesday, and I was like, okay, I mean, I guess I'm teaching my class, and I didn't want to put that on them, to feel as if they had to support me. I didn't even know what I needed right at that point. And so sometimes it is just like knowing what I can share, because I do really think it's important that if I'm asking students to share about their own grief experiences, that I'm modeling a bit of that, and what's safe to do. In the semester, it didn't feel safe for me to talk with my students about this recent loss. And so I think it's threading that needle of how much do I share? I certainly don't ever want students to feel like they need to be my grief support, right? But I do want to model the importance of reflecting on how our personal experiences shape the way we show up, right? In classroom spaces, in webinars, right? In the research that we do. So I don't have a magic answer for that, but I guess I just am constantly, trying to reflect on, and I do this in the grief groups too, right? So I didn't share with the grief groups I lead this fall either that I had experienced that loss. And so I did take a bit of time away from those groups before I felt like I could come back and really hold space. But yeah, it's, thinking about, will this thing that I share support the person that's in front of me, or will it really turn the conversation now back onto me, which is not what I want as a support professional. So, yeah.
And thank you so much for being so candid and open with your own experience. Before I sign us out and we close, is there anything else that you think you want to share? I know we'll share the resources that you've highlighted, but is there any final gem of advice, something you want to touch on again, a memoir or something that really resonated with you? And know that we will share things beyond this with those who've joined us.
I mean, I think I would just amplify what you said a moment ago, Tiffany, which is don't be afraid to ask for help, right? I think that was such a good point to raise. There's nothing to, yeah, grief support is available. There are people who want to help and maybe don't know how to offer that. But if you can tell people what might be helpful or what it is that you need, in my experience, people have surprised me. And in my experience, we might be a grief phobic culture, we might be a grief avoidant culture, but there's also a wealth of information out there, right? So I just gave you a taste of that with the 12 resources there, but there are a lot of wonderful online resources that you can find and communities that you can find. So I would just say, even if you're grieving a loss from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and don't be afraid to seek support or ask for help.
And just know that the process of finding that information or what resonates for you or what speaks to your experience is different for everyone. Sometimes it's therapy, sometimes it's a couple different situations or care groups that you need to be connected with or professionals to find the right fit. Sometimes it's one book versus another, or art therapy or a trip or getting out in nature. So please know, if nothing else, it is do what you can, support yourself, support those you love. And no one is perfect at this, even with so much research and information and practice as you have had. So thank you for modeling that for us as well. With that, I'm going to say thank you all who've joined us this evening. I want to thank Professor Brooks again for being so candid and present with sharing her knowledge and hard-earned advice and experience on one of the most difficult topics for any of us to encounter and deal with, and know that it's going to be present in our lives. We hope that you found this time with us valuable, and we wish you well in your own experiences and journeys with grief. Please find your people, please take care. And with that, we hope that you will join us for other Willamette in Dialogue events, and that you, more importantly, take care of yourself and those you love, and that you stay warm as we approach this holiday season. So with that, I'm going to close everything and say good night, and thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to shut off our stuff. So take care, everybody. Have a good one.